So I have a problem. I'm going to an event and I have nothing to wear. Now that I have my Edwardian Slip, it's time to start working on the dress. The design for this dress went through several iterations. I originally intended to recreate a pattern from Nora Waugh's The Cut of Women's Clothes, but as you may remember from my previous video, I'm having to make this project for as little money as possible. And that Nora Waugh dress was originally made in wool, which I just cannot afford. Instead, I went for this brown viscose twill fabric, which I got from Pound Fabrics for £1.50 a metre. A little bit of false advertising there with the name of the shop, but I'm willing to overlook it. This very unhistorically accurate fabric meant that I had to completely rethink my design. But I still wanted to keep the corselet style skirt because that's just so characteristic of this era. However, as you may know if you've watched some of my previous videos, I have scoliosis, which is a sideways curvature of the spine. In fact, I have two curvatures, making my spine S-shaped. This means that I have previously avoided making anything this fitted because my body is so asymmetrical. And fitting something like a corset on yourself is hard enough, even when your rib cage, pelvis, and shoulders don't all point in different directions. But I knew that if I wanted to continue making historical costumes, I would one day have to face the fitting nightmare that is making a corset for my wonky body. And for some reason, I chose to do it on a project where I can't spend any money and I've got a 3-week deadline. As this make was so challenging for a number of reasons, the design actually evolved over time. I originally wanted to make a high neck shirt waist style blouse to go with my corselet skirt, but given the tight budget and deadline, I chose to buy some bright white stretch lace, again from Pound Fabrics, for £1.90 a metre, and use a 1980 sewing pattern for an Edwardian, almost prairie-style blouse that I inherited from my German great-aunt. The finished result was just awful. I don't know why I thought I would be able to get anything like a vaguely historically appropriate result from such modern components. I vastly overestimated my own abilities there, and so I had to return to the drawing board and rethink my design again. I finally had something I thought would work, and so it could be put off no more. I had to start cutting what would be the first of many, many toiles for the corselet skirt. To make the pattern, I used the same dress block as my princess slip. I knew that this was going to be much too big for a garment that needed to fit skin tight, but as I knew I was going to have to do a lot of alterations anyway, I'd rather start too big than too small. I used washed calico for all my toiles. I knew I wanted to repurpose the final toile into the lining of the skirt, so that's why I went for proper calico and not old bed sheets or something. The calico I had bought from a different budget fabric shop called Pound a Metre. Again, misleading, as I actually paid £2 a metre. To save on fabric, I'm only cutting the toiles using the top half of my pattern, and to where the skirt starts to flare over the thighs. This calico lining will eventually be reinforced with boning to make the supportive understructure of the corselet skirt. I'm not wearing a proper corset with this dress, so all the shaping needs to come from the skirt lining and interlining. And so as you can see, the first toile is much too big, but that was to be expected. So I began pinning in the excess as best I could on myself. This was of course very tricky on the back, but I managed with the help of the camera. I then machined in those alterations so that I could see how they actually changed the fit. And this is where I started to get a bit self-conscious about just how crooked my back, hips, and ribcage are. You can see that when I just stand normally, how the right side of the back practically folds in half because it's so much shorter than the left side. I made so many little tweaks and alterations to this pattern, and I must confess it was such a long and difficult process, I couldn't really bring myself to film it all. I ended up taking out a very strange wedge across the small of my back that was almost like a horizontal dart. In the end, I had to settle for good enough. The fit still wasn't perfect, and I could probably have got it better with the help of a friend and more time, but I was on a deadline, so I had to just make my peace with it and move on. I dismantled the toile and turned the fabric pieces into a paper pattern. I then cut another set of calico pieces that would be the final toile and would become the lining.
beautiful garden has withered away. Where you
I reused the pieces from the previous toile to become the interlining.
cottage for sale.
I made them shorter, reaching to just below the hip, and then interfaced them with fusible interfacing. I deliberately used the papery kind here because I wanted that structure, but also because I was using what I had in my stash.
Now the keys in the mailbox the same as before, but no one is waiting for me anymore. The end of our story is told.
You can see the difference it makes to the pattern pieces here. For speed, I used the overlocker to flatline everything together. I just lined the lining and the interlining up and jammed it through the overlocker as fast as I could. I used the blade to neaten up any indiscrepancies in the cutting of the lining and the interlining pieces. Then I could start constructing the whole lining. I pinned all the pieces together precisely along the sewing lines, making sure to match all my balance marks, as I'd added these to make sure I was getting the panels in the right order. Because the pattern pieces were so asymmetrical, there was no way the skirt would fit if I accidentally flipped one of the pieces. To help sew the long seams precisely, I used my machine's tray table and then got to sewing all those panels together. As the finished lining was rather curvy, I pressed all the seams open over my tailor's ham to help set the curves into the fabric. I then quickly machined in some hook and eye tape from my stash so that I could close the lining at the centre back as the finished skirt would close, and then I could try it on once again. As you can see, it's still not great. I had quite a few wrinkles at the waist, and that right back and side seam was still folding in on themselves massively. I made a few more tweaks, just moving the seams in a few places and out in others, but still there wasn't much improvement, so I decided to try snipping my seam allowance, as this is supposed to eliminate puckers, and adding some boning. I used the sew-in Ridgeline boning, widely hated by historical costumers for its inaccuracy, but honestly I don't mind it. It's cheaper, easier to work with, and more importantly more comfortable to wear. Plus, if you know what you're doing, you could still get good results. I sewed the bones to the inside of the lining as I was worried they would show through the lightweight viscous fabric, and the boning and the snipping did improve things. We've still got quite a few strain marks and wrinkles, but the right back no longer folds in on itself, which is good. So with time against me, I called the lining done and moved on to actually making the rest of the skirt, or as it had become at this point, the dress. I used the pattern pieces from the lining to cut the fabric of the skirt, plus the original pattern pieces I had drafted from the dress block to get the angle of the flared skirt right. I hadn't bothered to redraft the full pattern every time I made alterations, just the top third or so. So, as you can see from this hot pink stuff behind me, can you see it on the cutting table there as well, just about? I've had to stop working on my Edwardian project because I've had a paid job come in, which I was expecting. This should be quite a short job, so I am still hoping that I'm going to make this Edwardian outfit in time. So that's what I've been working on today, and I've got my overlocker out. I've overlocked everything I can, and I'm waiting for things to arrive in the post before I can carry on with the pink contract. So I think what I'm going to do is see if I can sneak in overlocking my skirt panels, which I cut a few days ago now, before the postman arrives and brings me the rest of the things I need to finish this job. The cutting was really difficult. It was really time consuming, really tiring. I had to cut everything single layer, and then I tried to cut the one front piece on the fold single layer as well, and it ended up like completely skewed like this. So I then had to recut it. I also cut the sewing line instead of the cutting line, you know, and I was like, oh, for goodness sake. So I had to recut my front piece, which means I've got less fabric to work with now for the top, the jacket section of this ensemble. But we'll have to make it work, really, won't we? So let's hope I can get this overlocking done before the postman arrives. And then, as if this project wasn't hard enough, why is nothing in my life ever straightforward? So I have just delivered on the deadline for my most recent professional job, which means I am back to working on this Edwardian project. However, I've been having a lot of trouble with my sewing machine this year, but I rang the sewing machine mechanic and I've possibly f***ed it really bad as well. Not only have I, yes, definitely got a circuit board fault, but also I've been sewing on this circuit board fault, which means I've possibly caused even more issues for my machine. So that means I've had to get out my backup brother sewing machine, which is currently what the tripod is standing on. Just typical. It's just typical. But at least I can still sew and hopefully make everything ready in time for this event. Thankfully, the construction of the skirt was actually quite simple, just lots of long skirt seams. The tricky part was of course getting the panels in the right order, as they have to match the lining exactly. I then tacked in the hook and eye tape again, putting the lining on the dress form and then the skirt fabric over the lining, and then tacked them together on the stand before I started work on draping the top half of the bodice. Like I say, the design had changed so much at this point, I was really just winging it. I started draping what I thought was going to be a jacket, but then I actually decided I didn't have time to make a jacket, so I cut an all-in-one bodice based on this one, just without the princess seams. Before I made up the bodice, I started on adding the decoration. This all came from stash. In fact, these bits of black velvet literally came from my scraps pile. I was really working with what I had here, and I was so short of time, my camera work was getting worse and worse, so I apologise. I cut panels of the black velvet to make a sort of mock collar, based on a few styles of dress I had seen. Then I just turned under the edges and hand-stitched the velvet in place. I left raw edges at the neckline, as I was going to finish those with some sort of facing later. I used scraps of the viscose to make a template for the piece that would go over the shoulders, so that they would be equal on both sides. Then again, cut in velvet, hand sew in place. I had left the bodice deliberately too long, thinking I would try it on with the skirt and decide how much I wanted the bodice to blouse, but I didn't have time, so I literally just cut it and hoped. To add some more texture, I found some black lace in my stash, left over from a previous contract, that I hand-stitched on the folded edges of the velvet. I also added velvet and lace to the cuffs. I had literally just enough lace. And then I had to work on neatening the raw edges around the neckline and cuffs. For this, I made bias strips of the leftover viscose and machined them on right sides together around the neckline. This was tricky with the velvet and this not so high quality machine, so I just went very slowly and used lots of pins. This was a case of less haste, more speed, as I really did not want to have to be unpicking anything at this stage, especially if velvet is involved. I could then roll the bias strips around to the inside and herringbone them in place. I couldn't really press the edge of the neckline to get it crisp because of the velvet, so had to roll the right side around to the wrong side more than I normally would, so that the brown bias was definitely going to be hidden. I also neatened the back opening by turning in the raw edges and herringboning it in place. I must have also overlocked the raw edges of the bodice at some point, but I didn't film that, so I don't know when I did that. I also didn't film inserting the placket into the skirt of the dress or adding the hooks and bars. You can see I didn't have enough bars, so I made a thread bar for one of the hooks near the bottom that are under less tension. I could then join the bodice to the skirt. The bottom edge of the bodice had to be gathered down slightly to fit. This was not really a design feature, just my slapdash cutting, and I'm not sure I like how it looks, but you'll have to wait to see what I mean. As the bodice wasn't going to be under any tension and I had run out of hooks and bars, I used poppers, or snaps, as the centre back closure. Then all that was left was the hem. I went for a shorter than historically accurate hem, just because it's better for me and my mobility needs. I used my hem marker to level the hem and chopped off the excess. I had no idea how I was going to finish the hem, and then I had the bright idea to just bind it in bias binding and it would look like period appropriate hem tape. I had almost a whole roll of black satin bias binding left over from the same contract as the black lace, so I used that and these little clips before running stitching it in place. But as always when you're on a deadline, my thread kept knotting and getting stuck on the little clips, and then it turned out the stitches weren't securing the binding in place at all, so I switched the camera off and finished up the last few bits off screen. And then finally, I had a dress. I did get to wear this dress to my event last October, and I was pleased with it at the time, mostly I think just because I managed to make it in time. What I am really proud of is the fact that I was brave enough to take on such a difficult project to fit. I think I did okay, all things considered, and most importantly, the next time I have to do something like this, it will be much easier. While it's by no means historically accurate, this dress does work for me. Despite being very fitted, it's very comfortable to wear for long periods, even sitting down. And while it's fun to sit for a picture like an elegant Edwardian lady, the reality is I spend most of my time sitting something like this, and that's just as comfy. The hem might be too short, but I think I did sort of get a suitable Edwardian silhouette. And to say I've no corset, just some calico, interfacing and ridgeling boning, I think it's actually a pretty good attempt. The bit I'm not happy about is the way the bodice drapes where it's attached to the skirt. I think I either needed to make it more fitted or much more gathered. It's sort of in a meh, in-between space, and that's just not quite right. The other thing is I think I need to add armpit gussets. As this is an all-in-one sleeve, there's quite a lot of pulling, and I can see that the fabric is already starting to fray there. I don't know, it's just not quite got that pigeon-breasted Edwardian shape. Maybe if I added a bust improver, the silhouette might become more dramatic. To say I threw this together in 3 weeks, despite my wonky body, despite my tiny budget, despite my sewing machine breaking down and all my other usual health concerns, all in all, I think I did okay. It's also really comfy and was perfect for an informal event to just hang out with friends. Most importantly, I had fun, and I hope you did too. Thanks for watching. See you next time.